The joy of Mozart. Actually, I sometimes think that Mozart's reputation is a bit skewed. Not because he isn't one of the most incredible composers who ever wrote music, because he is, but there's this idea that he was this fabulous boy genius, that he came into the world fully formed as a great composer. He came into the world as an incredibly talented composer. But actually, if you were to imagine, horror of horrors, that someone had killed him off at the age of 18, the kind of music that would have been left, I doubt we'd be playing very much of it in the concert hall these days. It's extraordinarily well written for a young man of that age, but you keep having to say that. And often there's not a lot of emotional depth behind the superficial brilliance. What seems to me the most miraculous thing about Mozart is that he grew from being, well, I won't say a super brat, but from a phenomenally precocious and possibly rather irritating youngster into an incredibly profound and original composer. And it seems to have happened by existential stages. It's very striking that all the music in this program comes from later on in Mozart's life, after he'd experienced two of the biggest, you might say, existential moments in his life. One of them was the death of his mother when he was in his early 20s. And it's very interesting how you begin to notice a new emotional depth coming into his music after that. Things like the wonderful Symphony Concertante for violin, viola, and orchestra, slow movement of that. That's not a young man writing, you feel. This is a man with a bit of experience of life and its pain. And then comes the second big existential step, which is how Mozart eventually managed to engineer his own dismissal from the service of the hated Archbishop of Salzburg. The Archbishop really does not seem to have appreciated Mozart's genius at all, doesn't seem to have seen his music and his talent as an adornment, and did almost everything he could to keep him under wraps. Mozart's father was very keen on Mozart staying in the Archbishop's service because trying to make a living as a freelance composer in those days was something almost unheard of. But as I said, Mozart managed to wangle it so that he was actually quite literally kicked out of the Archbishop's service and took to Vienna with nobody behind him backing him up, which was a pretty unusual step for a composer in those days, and started looking around to see what he could do to create a career for himself. Well, he did actually do astonishingly well until his last years. The idea that he lived in poverty and wasn't recognized simply isn't true at all. And in fact, he had a fabulous career for a while as a composer pianist, playing his own, particularly his own marvelous piano concertos, of which we hear a classic example in this concert tonight, the Piano Concerto number 20 in D minor, a stormy, dark, turbulent piece. You'd think from this that Mozart was going through some particular emotional storm and stress himself, but actually the story around this concerto is quite different. It was written in 1785, that's 3 years after Mozart got himself kicked out of the Archbishop's service. And actually, it was the source of the beginning of the reconciliation between himself and his father. Leopold Mozart came to Vienna, heard Mozart play this concerto, was deeply impressed, very warmed by the response of the audience to this, and gave Mozart eventually his blessing. He also gave Mozart his blessing on something else that he'd done without his father's permission, which is marry the young singer Constanze Weber, who became a very loyal and wonderful and supportive wife to Mozart all the way through this period. The other piece that's interesting that reflects a big, as you might say, existential moment in Mozart's career, by the time he came to write his opera, The Marriage of Figaro, he'd written quite a few operas, some of them fairly remarkable, but I think it's with The Marriage of Figaro, which was begun around the same time as the concerto, Mozart steps from supreme talent into real greatness. This is comedy on its very highest level. And this tiny overture is the most wonderful bit of scene setting. You can imagine on one level the servants in the opera getting together, scurrying together, laying the table for a great feast. At the same time, it's the sort of the buzz in the opera house. It's as though Mozart's actually written an overture that expresses the excitement that mounts as you wait for the curtain to come up on the opera stage. And it's perfect from that point of view. It's the most delightful little miniature that just seems to compress so much into 4 minutes, which is more or less what it lasts. Finally, in the second half, Symphony number 41, known as the Jupiter. This nickname has nothing to do with Mozart himself, who didn't give any of his symphonies names. It's a convenient nickname that's been stuck to it in later years, though in some ways it really does suit it. This was written later in Mozart's career, at a time when things were a bit different. And we know infuriatingly little about how this music was written, and also how often or even when it was performed. Some pretty good guesses can be taken. But at the time, it seems, Mozart's reputation was beginning to change, and things were changing also in the financial conditions in Vienna, and he wasn't getting quite as much support as he had been earlier on. And the darker tone of quite a few of his later works, notably that extraordinary Requiem that he wrote as he was dying, almost. You can begin to feel this stirring in the music. This is an incredible piece because, as with so often with Mozart, it's emotionally incredibly, almost kaleidoscopic. You seem to go through almost every kind of emotion in this piece. Broadly, outwardly, it's a confident, assertive, bright piece that begins with a ceremonial opening with fanfares and trumpets and drums, which really suggests a great event at the Imperial Palace. But almost immediately, you'll notice, the woodwind quietly start questioning this. And all the way through the symphony, there are moments when Mozart seems to stand back from what he's said and say, oh, but maybe there's another side to this. Slow movement, for instance, it's beautiful, it's elegant, it's graceful, but there are moments of real pathos in it, moments of real darkness in that slow movement. Beautiful minuet, very extraordinary dancing movement. But then comes the finale, which again goes through a whole kaleidoscope of moves before Mozart does something quite astonishing in the final moments of this symphony. He takes all the themes in the finale, and I think there are about 7 of them, and he combines them on top of each other in a kind of whirling contrapuntal kaleidoscope. So you'll just hear all the different sections of the orchestra passing one theme to another theme to another theme, reacting to each other. It's the most incredible passage, I think, one of the most wonderful endings to a symphony in the repertoire. The composer Alexander Glazunov said it was like standing in front of the facade of Cologne Cathedral, one of the grandest and most imposing cathedrals in the world. I think that's a pretty good comparison too. If you could imagine that all the parts of Cologne Cathedral are also moving like a kaleidoscope, I think that would come closer to it at all. Is it a joyous, triumphant symphony? Is it a symphony that looks into darker, more doubtful regions? I think the answer is yes, it does both. And an awful lot depends on how you feel when you listen to it, and also on the performance that we'll hear in this concert. But I think it's an extraordinary example of how Mozart, in what is still a newish form, the symphony, recognizes music without words, without voices, without even in his original case, a title, has an astonishing power to suggest stories to us, narratives, dramas, psychological perspectives. Oh, and it's also full of marvelous tunes.